The crystal towers of First Light rose into the purple sky like frozen music. Inside the highest spire, King White Star paced back and forth, his silvery robes catching the light of 3 setting suns. His steps echoed through the empty throne room, each footfall sending tiny ripples through the living crystal beneath his feet. He was worried, very worried. The king stopped at a massive window and looked down at his world. The city spread out below him like a garden of light and geometry, each building perfectly designed, each street laid out with mathematical precision. Everything on First Light was perfect, planned, and logical. Perhaps, he thought, that was the problem. "Send them in," he commanded, his voice tired but firm. The great doors slid open without a sound, and 5 figures entered the throne room. His daughters. Each princess moved with perfect grace, their skin shimmering with the pale blue glow of their species. They stood before him, arranging themselves by age, a habit drilled into them since childhood. "Father," they said in unison, bowing their heads. King White Star studied them carefully. Morning Light, his eldest, stood tall and proud in her military uniform. Next to her, Sunset Glow clutched her data tablet, probably running some complex calculation even now. Storm Cloud wore her diplomatic robes, while Moon Shadow had specks of creative matter still clinging to her fingers from her latest art project. And Little Stardust, the youngest, tried to hide behind her sisters. "Do you know why I've called you here?" he asked. They remained silent. They knew. 17 suitors, the king continued. 17 of the finest minds from the most advanced worlds in our galaxy, all rejected. He waved his hand, and a holographic display appeared, showing the faces of various alien nobles. "This one was too logical," you said. "That one lacked creativity. Another was too focused on efficiency." "Father," Morning Light stepped forward. "None of them were worthy of." "Enough." For the first time in years, the king raised his voice. The crystal walls hummed in response. "Our civilization leads the galaxy in science, art, and culture. But we have become," he searched for the word, "stagnant." He touched a crystal on his wrist, and a new image appeared in the air. A blue and green planet, swirling with white clouds. "This is Earth. A young world with a young species. They call themselves humans." The princesses exchanged confused looks. Everyone knew about Earth. It was a primitive world that had barely achieved spaceflight. "My decree is this." King White Star straightened to his full height. "You will wed a human." The reaction was immediate, and exactly what he expected. Morning Light's hand went to her energy sword. Sunset Glow dropped her tablet. Storm Cloud began citing interstellar marriage laws. Moon Shadow gasped dramatically. Only Stardust remained quiet, her large eyes studying the image of Earth with curiosity. "Father, you cannot be serious," Morning Light protested. "They're barely out of their Stone Age. They still use chemical rockets. They fight wars over primitive resources," added Storm Cloud. "Their mathematics is practically medieval," Sunset Glow sneered. "Their art is physical," Moon Shadow said with a shudder. King White Star held up his hand for silence. "My decision is final. Our observers have found a suitable candidate. He is different from our people, yes. His ways are strange to us, certainly. But perhaps," he smiled mysteriously, "that is exactly what we need." "And if we refuse?" Morning Light challenged. The king's expression hardened. "Then you will give up your rights to the throne. All of you. I will find other heirs, ones who understand that progress comes from change, not perfection." The throne room fell silent. The princesses stood frozen, their perfect world suddenly turned upside down. Outside, the last sun set, casting long shadows through the crystal towers. The king looked at each of his daughters in turn. "The human arrives in 3 days. Prepare yourselves." He turned away, signaling that the audience was over. As the princesses left the throne room, their minds racing with plans and protests, none of them noticed their father's small smile. None of them understood that sometimes the most logical solution was to embrace chaos. James sat at his desk in Earth's first deep space communications outpost, staring at the message on his screen. He read it again. Sure, he must have made a mistake, but the words remained the same. You have been chosen by the civilization of First Light to meet their royal family. He ran his fingers through his messy brown hair and looked around the small control room. Everything was normal. The usual beeps and hums of equipment, the gentle vibration of the station's life support systems, the distant rumble of cargo ships docking. Nothing suggested this was a strange dream. They want me, he muttered to himself. Why me? The door slid open and Station Commander Rogers walked in. She was smiling, which was unusual enough to make James nervous. I guess you got the message, she said, sitting down across from him. There must be a mistake, James replied. I'm just a communications specialist. Shouldn't they want someone more important? The commander shook her head. They specifically asked for you. Their observers have been watching our outpost for months. They were particularly interested in how you solved the quantum interference problem last week. James frowned. That hadn't been anything special. When the station's advanced communications array had started picking up strange interference, he'd fixed it by using an old radio technique he'd learned from his grandfather. It wasn't high-tech or clever. It was just simple. But they're the most advanced civilization we've met, he protested. Their technology is centuries ahead of ours. They have ships that can fold space, cities made of living crystal. They can literally reshape matter with their thoughts. And yet, Commander Rogers leaned forward. They want you. A human who fixes quantum problems with radio tricks from the 20th century. She grinned. Pack your bags, James. You leave tomorrow. The next day, James stood in the station's docking bay with a small bag containing everything he owned. He watched through the reinforced windows as the First Light ship approached. It was beautiful, like a piece of living art. The ship seemed to be made of light itself, its hull flowing and shifting like liquid starlight. As the ship docked, James felt his heart racing. What could such an advanced civilization want with him? The docking tube extended, forming a seamless connection with the station. The door opened, revealing two tall figures with pale blue skin and silvery robes. James of Earth, one of them said, bowing slightly. I am Guide, and this is Observer. We are here to escort you to First Light. James swallowed hard and nodded. Nice to meet you. I don't suppose you could tell me why I was chosen. Guide and Observer exchanged looks. The King of First Light sees potential in your unique way of thinking, Guide said carefully. My unique way of thinking? James asked as they led him onto their ship. The interior was even more impressive than the outside, with corridors that seemed to be made of flowing light. Yes, Observer added. You solve problems differently than we do. For example, your solution to the quantum interference. Our scientists spent years developing complex algorithms to filter such interference. You used a simple wave cancellation technique. Primitive, but effective. James wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an insult. As they showed him to his quarters, a room that looked like it was carved from a single giant diamond, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this invitation than they were telling him. Looking out the window of his room, he watched Earth's outpost grow smaller as the ship prepared for departure. Whatever waited for him on First Light, he had a feeling his life was about to become very interesting. He had no idea just how right he was. The 5 princesses gathered in Morning Light's private training chamber, far from their father's watchful eyes. The room hummed with energy as Morning Light paced back and forth, her energy sword crackling at her hip. He arrives today, she said, stopping to face her sisters. This human. She spoke the word like it left a bad taste in her mouth. Sunset Glow didn't look up from her floating screens of data. I've analyzed everything we know about him. Their species still relies on chemical synapses for thought. No natural telepathy. No energy manipulation. They can't even see the quantum layer. She shook her head in disgust. Storm Cloud, always the practical one, sat cross-legged on a cushion of suspended air. Perhaps that's why Father chose him. To teach us humility. She smoothed her diplomatic robes. Though I must admit, explaining our customs to someone so basic will be challenging. Basic? Moon Shadow laughed, her voice musical. She waved her hand, and the creative matter around her formed into a small replica of Earth. Have you seen their art? They use physical tools to create static images. Nothing moves, nothing lives. She crushed the Earth model with a flick of her wrist. Only Stardust, the youngest, remained quiet. She sat in the corner, watching her sisters with large, thoughtful eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. I've been studying their adaptability. Her sisters turned to look at her. They're interesting, Stardust continued, standing up. When they can't do something naturally, they build tools. When they can't fly, they make machines that can. When they can't see something, they invent devices to see it for them. She walked to the window, looking out at the crystal spires of their city. They never accept limitations. That's exactly the problem, Morning Light declared. They're like children playing with forces they don't understand. Did you know they split atoms for energy? Split atoms. She ignited her energy sword, its blade humming with controlled power. They're dangerous. Sunset Glow finally looked up from her screens. I have a plan, she said, smiling. Each of us will test him. Show Father that this human isn't worthy of our family. The sisters gathered closer as Sunset Glow outlined her plan. Morning Light would challenge his courage and strength. Sunset Glow would test his understanding of advanced sciences. Storm Cloud would evaluate his diplomatic skills. Moon Shadow would assess his cultural sophistication. And Stardust, well, they didn't really expect their youngest sister to come up with anything challenging. He'll fail, Morning Light said confidently. How could he not? A soft chime echoed through the chamber. The human ship had arrived. The princesses moved to the grand observation balcony, watching as the royal transport glided toward the palace. Even from this distance, they could sense how primitive the human was. No energy signature, no quantum resonance, just simple, basic life. Remember, Storm Cloud cautioned, we must be diplomatic. Father is watching. Of course, Morning Light agreed. We'll be perfect princesses, and when he fails our tests, Father will have to admit his mistake. As they watched the ship dock, none of the sisters noticed Stardust's small frown. She alone had read deeper into the human's records. She had seen something in his simple solutions that her sisters had missed. Sometimes, she thought, the most elegant answer was the simplest one. But she kept these thoughts to herself as they prepared to meet James. After all, she was just the youngest princess. What did she know about their father's plans or the true potential of humans? The answer, as they would all soon discover, was quite a lot. James stood in the center of the great crystal hall, trying not to look as overwhelmed as he felt. The 5 princesses circled him like beautiful, glowing sharks. Their father, King White Star, watched from his floating throne with an unreadable expression. The trials will begin now, Morning Light announced, stepping forward. Her energy sword hummed at her side. Your first test is with me, human. James nodded, wiping his sweaty palms on his simple Earth uniform. What's the challenge? Morning Light smiled, and suddenly the crystal floor beneath them shifted. The hall transformed into a massive arena, with floating platforms at different heights. Simple. Reach the top platform. You have 1 hour. She activated her energy sword and floated upward. Of course, I'll be defending it. The other princesses watched from viewing bubbles, their expressions ranging from amusement to curiosity. Stardust leaned forward, her eyes wide with interest. James looked up at the platforms. The aliens could fly and had energy weapons. He had his brain. He studied the crystal walls, then smiled. Can I use anything in this room? The room itself is off limits. Morning Light declared. But you may use any loose objects. James nodded and walked to a decorative crystal bowl. He picked it up, testing its weight. Perfect. What happened next surprised everyone. Instead of trying to climb the platforms, James began breaking the bowl into pieces. He pulled a small roll of tape from his pocket. He always carried some, habit from fixing communication equipment, and started building something. What is he doing? Sunset Glow asked, frowning at her readings. I detect no energy manipulation. 10 minutes later, James had created a simple but effective grappling hook from the crystal shards and his belt. The princesses watched in confusion as he threw it up to catch the first platform. That's primitive, Moon Shadow said, but she couldn't hide her interest. Platform by platform, James worked his way up. When Morning Light tried to stop him with her energy sword, he used the reflective crystal surfaces to redirect her attacks. When she created energy barriers, he found gaps in their geometry. Each solution was simple, physical, and effective. With 5 minutes to spare, James reached the top platform. Morning Light stood there, her sword lowered, looking at him with new eyes. How? She demanded. You used no energy manipulation, no quantum fields, no gravity control. James shrugged, slightly out of breath. Sometimes the old ways work best. Your energy sword is amazing, but it follows basic rules of light reflection. Your barriers are perfect geometry, which means they have predictable weak points. Back on the ground, King White Star nodded approvingly, but the trials weren't over. Sunset Glow stepped forward next. With a wave of her hand, she created a holographic display of a complex quantum engine. Fix it, she commanded. It's losing containment. James studied the display. The other princesses smirked, knowing this advanced technology would surely stump him. But James saw something they didn't expect. Can I draw on this? He asked, pointing to the hologram. Sunset Glow blinked in surprise. Draw? Like, physically mark it? Yes. She allowed it, curious. James pulled out his marker, another habit from work, and started drawing simple lines on the hologram. He traced energy flows, marking points where quantum fields intersected. Your quantum matrix is beautiful, he said, but it's too complex. Look, he pointed to his drawings. If you simplify these intersection points, the energy flows naturally. Sometimes adding more technology creates more problems. The engine's containment stabilized. Sunset Glow stared at the display, then at James. For the first time in her life, she was speechless. In his throne, King White Star's smile grew wider. The human was exceeding his expectations, and they were only halfway through the trials. Storm Cloud's diplomatic challenge came next. She created a holographic council chamber filled with projections of the galaxy's most difficult diplomatic species. James found himself surrounded by floating energy beings, crystalline intelligences, and even a hive mind that spoke in mathematical equations. Solve the trade dispute, Storm Cloud commanded, sitting back with a satisfied smile. These species haven't agreed on anything in 3 centuries. James looked around the chamber, studying each alien representative. Then he did something unexpected. He turned off the holographic displays. What are you doing? Storm Cloud demanded. Those are some of the most sophisticated diplomatic simulations in the galaxy. Sometimes, James said, we need to see less to understand more. He pulled out his notebook, yet another habit from his communication work, and drew a simple circle. Every species in that simulation wanted something different, but they all wanted to trade. Instead of trying to make everyone happy, let's find the one thing they all need. He drew lines connecting different points on the circle, explaining how each species could contribute one thing to a trade ring. It wasn't elegant or complex, but it worked. The solution was so simple that Storm Cloud stared at it for several minutes before speaking. But where are the algorithmic negotiation matrices, the quantum probability calculations? Not needed, James said. Trade is about people, or beings. Basic needs. Basic wants. Moon Shadow stepped forward for her test, her creative matter swirling around her like a glittering storm. Art, she declared. Show us how humans create. She expected him to fail completely at manipulating the responsive matter. Instead, James asked for something that confused her, a bucket of water and some stones. Using these simple materials, he created a small rock garden with a trickling water feature. The sound of water moving over stones filled the chamber with peaceful music. The creative matter around Moon Shadow responded to the natural patterns, creating unexpected harmonies. It's so physical, Moon Shadow whispered, watching the water flow. But it makes the creative matter dance in ways I've never seen. Stardust, who had been watching each trial intently, moved closer to examine James's creation. It's beautiful because it's real, she said softly. Our art responds to it because it follows the true patterns of nature. The other princesses gathered around the small garden, watching how their sophisticated creative matter interacted with the simple water flow. For the first time, they saw beauty in simplicity. King White Star rose from his throne and approached. You begin to understand, he said to his daughters, why I chose him. Morning Light shook her head. But father, he's so limited. He can't manipulate energy, he can't control matter, he can't even see quantum fields. Perhaps, the king replied, those limitations are exactly what we need. Look at what he has accomplished today. He reached an impossible height without flight. He fixed quantum technology without quantum sight. He solved a diplomatic crisis without probability matrices. He created art that moves our most sophisticated materials, all with water and stones. James stood quietly, feeling uncomfortable with the attention. I just solve problems the way we do on Earth. We work with what we have. Stardust moved to stand beside him. That's what Father wants us to learn, she said, her eyes bright with understanding. We've become so dependent on our advanced technology that we've forgotten how to see simple solutions. The other princesses looked at each other, then at James, then at their father. Something was changing in their perfect, orderly world. And surprisingly, they were beginning to think that might not be such a bad thing. The warning alarms rang through the Crystal Palace without warning. The perfect, harmonious hum of First Light's capital city turned into a discordant shriek. The crystal walls themselves began to pulse with angry red light. The quantum core. Sunset Glow shouted, her hands flying over multiple holographic displays. Something's wrong with the planetary quantum core. King White Star's face grew serious. The quantum core powered their entire civilization. It was the heart of their world, the source of all their advanced technology. Explain, he commanded. The containment fields are failing, Sunset Glow said, her voice shaking. The quantum harmonics are destabilizing. Nothing makes sense. Our systems say everything is perfect, but clearly it's not. The other princesses rushed to help. Morning Light activated emergency shields around the city. Storm Cloud coordinated with other worlds for potential evacuation. Moon Shadow used her creative matter to try to stabilize the failing crystal structures. Stardust monitored the biological impacts on their people. James stood back, watching the chaos unfold. The aliens' technology was amazing, but right now it was telling them everything was fine while their world was literally coming apart. Can I see? He asked quietly. The princesses were too busy to object. Sunset Glow waved him over to a display showing the core structure. James studied it, ignoring the complex quantum readings and focusing on the basic power flow. Your quantum core, he said slowly, it's like a power plant, right? Energy in, energy out. It's far more complex than that. Sunset Glow snapped, frustrated. It's a self-sustaining quantum matrix that. But basically, James interrupted gently, energy in, energy out. King White Star nodded. At its most basic, yes. James pointed to a pattern in the energy flow. Look, every 1,000 cycles, there's a tiny hiccup. Your systems are so perfect, they automatically correct it. but each correction makes the next hiccup slightly bigger. The princesses gathered around, watching where he pointed. The quantum core is trying to establish a natural rhythm, James continued, but your systems keep forcing it back to perfect alignment. It's like, he thought for a moment, like trying to force a river to flow in a perfectly straight line. Eventually, the water's natural pattern will win. But our systems are perfect. Sunset Glow protested. The quantum alignments are precise to 100 decimal places. That's the problem, James said. Nature isn't perfect. Its patterns have small variations. By forcing perfection, you're fighting against the natural flow of quantum energy. Stardust's eyes widened. Like my garden. The plants grow better when we let them follow their natural patterns, instead of forcing them into perfect geometric shapes. Exactly, James smiled. You need to let the core find its natural rhythm. But how? Morning Light asked. Our systems can't be anything but perfect. James looked around and spotted a maintenance panel. Simple. Turn them off. What? All 5 princesses shouted at once. Not everything, James explained quickly. Just the automatic correction systems. Let the core's containment field flex naturally, like a river finding its own path. King White Star stepped forward. The human is right. Sunset Glow, disable the quantum correction protocols. For a tense minute, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the angry red light faded. The crystal walls stopped shaking. The core's energy patterns, freed from forced perfection, settled into a natural, slightly imperfect rhythm. The city was saved, not by advanced technology or perfect systems, but by understanding when to let go of perfection. King White Star looked at James with new respect. Then he turned to his daughters, who were staring at their readouts in amazement. Now, he said softly, you truly begin to understand why I chose him. The great hall of First Light's palace looked different now. The crystal walls pulsed with a gentler light, following the quantum core's natural rhythm. Like the core, they had stopped trying to force perfection, and somehow that made them more beautiful. James stood before King White Star and the 5 princesses, feeling both nervous and confused. After the crisis, everything had changed. The way they looked at him, the way they spoke to him, it was all different. James of Earth, King White Star began, his voice carrying through the hall. You were brought here under the premise of marriage to one of my daughters. James nodded, glancing at the princesses. Morning Light stood tall and proud as ever, but now there was respect in her eyes. Sunset Glow had finally put down her data screens. Storm Cloud watched with diplomatic interest. Moon Shadow smiled openly. And Stardust beamed like she already knew what was coming. But that, the king continued, was never my true intention. A murmur went through the watching crowd. Even the princesses looked surprised, except for Stardust. Father, Morning Light stepped forward. What do you mean? King White Star rose from his throne. Our civilization has achieved incredible things. We have mastered quantum energy, bent space to our will, created art from thought itself. But in our pursuit of perfection, we lost something vital. He walked down to stand before James. We lost the ability to see simple truths. The king waved his hand, and images appeared in the air. James using a crystal bowl to climb, drawing on a quantum diagram, turning off diplomatic simulations, making water flow over stones, and finally, saving their world by understanding when perfection wasn't needed. Each of you, he looked at his daughters, tried to prove that humanity's simple ways were inferior. Instead, you learned that sometimes the simplest solution is the best one. Stardust stepped forward. That's why you chose James, isn't it, Father? Not because you wanted us to marry him, but because you wanted us to learn from him. Yes, the king smiled, and because I want our worlds to learn from each other. He turned to James. I offer you a new role, not as a husband to one of my daughters, but as Earth's first ambassador to First Light. James blinked in surprise. Ambassador. Your people have something we need, the king explained. Creativity, adaptability, the ability to find elegant solutions with limited resources, and we have knowledge that could help Earth advance. He looked at his daughters. Each of you will work with James in your own fields. Together, you will build bridges between our worlds. The princesses moved forward one by one. Morning Light bowed slightly to James. I would be honored to exchange military strategies. Your insight into quantum mechanics is unconventional but valuable. Sunset Glow admitted. Storm Cloud smiled. Perhaps we can find more simple solutions to diplomatic challenges. I want to explore how physical art interacts with creative matter, Moonshadow added enthusiastically. Stardust just grinned. I knew Father was too wise to simply want us married off. James looked at them all, then at King Whitestar. I would be honored, he said, but I have one condition. Oh. The king raised an eyebrow. We take it slow, James said. No rushing to give Earth advanced technology. Let us learn from each other naturally, like the quantum core finding its rhythm. King Whitestar laughed. You see, he said to his daughters, wisdom comes in many forms. He turned back to James. Your condition is accepted, Ambassador. And so, in the great crystal hall of First Light, a new chapter began. Not a story of marriage or of one civilization teaching another, but of two very different peoples learning that sometimes the space between perfection and simplicity is where true progress lies. The end.